Good evening, everyone. I'm Assad Ali Mershid, the director of the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, and it's really my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's talk by our colleague and friend, Professor Mehran Kamrava. Mehran is professor and director of the Center for International and Regional Studies at the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service in Qatar. He holds a PhD in social and political sciences from the University of Cambridge. And he has authored a number of journal articles and is the author or editor of 10 books, including the titles The Modern Middle East, A Political History Since the First World War, Iran's Intellectual Revolution, Innovation in Islam, Traditions and Contributions, The International Politics of the Persian Gulf, The Political Economy of the Persian Gulf, Migrant Labor in the Persian Gulf. This is a volume that I've used recently in a grant proposal. It's edited by our colleague Zahra Baba, who's present among us today. And The Nuclear Question in the Middle East is another book. And most recently, obviously, the subject of tonight's talk, Qatar, Small State, Big Politics. And in Qatar, Small State, Big Politics, Mehran introduces the concept of subtle power as the prism through which to offer more fruitful and, frankly, more convincing considerations of the politics of the state of Qatar on the domestic and international levels. And to this extent, he offers an original, empirically grounded understanding of the relations between foreign policy making processes and local or domestic patterns of governance, business-state relations, and elite coalitions and decision-making. Moreover, the book delivers significant challenges to existing theories on the international relations of small states, arguing that conventional neorealist assumptions about the position of small states in the international system need refinement and contextualization. And as the Qatari case demonstrates very clearly, in certain instances, small states can actually become quite influential, even powerful in both regional and global arenas. And I'm very grateful to Professor Kamrava for accepting our invitation to share his insights on Qatar with us tonight. But before I cede the floor to him, I would like to thank our Public Affairs Coordinator, Elizabeth Sexton, who is hiding somewhere for all of her work in organizing and planning this event. And she's still organizing as we speak. And my thanks again to all of you for attending our event, and I'll now ask you to join me, please, in giving Professor Mehran Kamrava a very warm welcome to the CCAS.
Thank you all very much. Let me start by thanking Osama and his wonderful team for tonight's event. I'm most grateful and honored to be here. And thank you all. I was motivated to study Qatar. I've been in Qatar since 2007 at the Georgetown campus in Doha. And one of the first things that struck me about the country was its amazing development and its relative success. And so what motivated me to write this book was the simple question of whether or not Qatar is for real. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Qatar, but in many ways this is a country that consistently punches above its weight, to use an overused metaphor. And it's a small state which tries to be extremely consequential, not only within the Arabian Peninsula and within the Persian Gulf region, but in the larger Middle East and in fact beyond. And it exercises a certain amount of power that in many ways is incommensurate with its size, its demography, and its history. In a region where relatively great powers like Egypt and Syria and Iraq and Iran and Saudi Arabia have long influenced regional affairs and have long called the shots, if you will, Qatar has been extremely consequential over the last decade and a half, and has not only been extremely consequential, but it has also in many ways shaped the direction of current events and in fact history as it unfolds. So when I went there were several questions that I had, and one was what I posed to you earlier. is Qatar for real? Is this a country that is exercising a sort of power that is fleeting and impermanent, or is it a country that is in many ways consequential? And then, if you look at Doha, it's an amazing and it's a very odd city in terms of its development. It is engaged in what you might call high modernism, with a city that is growing into the sea and into the sky with artificial islands and high-rises. But it is also a city where you have very relatively little urban tradition. And the urban tradition that is there is state-directed. It's an urban tradition where the government deliberately tries to create a sort of heritage. And so the questions I had for myself were, to what extent does all of this mean anything, and how lasting is this? Is this something that's fleeting in the larger history of the Middle East, where we have the world's oldest civilizations, and where we have countries that have long shaped the history of the region? And the more I studied this, the more I realized a couple of things. First of all, I realized that Qatar is indeed a success story. It's not an unqualified success, but it is in many ways a success story, and that story needs to be told. I also realized that there's a series of developments and factors that have converged at the same time to result in what might be called Qatar's moment in history. Qatar currently is riding high. It is not only punching above its weight, but it is in many ways having a number of successes that are shaping, consequentially, Middle Eastern history. And so Qatar is in many ways a success story that needs to be told, but again, it does have some glitches. And then I realized, for myself as well as for others, it's a place that needs to be described, and it's a place that needs to be studied and analyzed, because it isn't just fleeting. When I went to Qatar, I had an extremely hard time describing the place for others. I remember one of my first official meetings was with a high-ranking diplomat, and I asked him, I said, how do you describe this place to others? It's extremely difficult to describe Qatar. And the image that he told me two images that stuck in my mind. One, he said, well, you know, this is like those scenes in James Bond movies where you have these national celebrations where people have their national dress and they're all getting together in beautiful colors of their own national dresses, and in many ways Qatar resembles that. And the second image that he told me about was more lasting. He said, imagine at that time the size of the population was about just over 1 million. He said you have 800,000 people waiting on 200,000 people. And that image really stuck with me. And so I decided, when I wrote this book, I thought one of the first things I needed to do was to describe this place that's difficult to describe, this odd place. And so bear with me as I attempt or read you a passage from the book and try to describe the place. And for those of you who've been in Qatar, you know there are lots of opulent buildings and very luxurious hotels. What I'm about to tell you is inspired by the description at the lobby of the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Doha. There are a number of other hotels that are newer and more opulent, but this particular passage, I've been there for more than 6 years now, close to 7 years, and every time I go into the lobby of the Ritz-Carlton, I'm in many ways overwhelmed by the opulence that I see. So I decided to start out with a description of Doha, and then I'll tell you a little bit about the kinds of power and influence that I think Qatar is exerting, and what are some of the ingredients for its success that Osama mentioned. Doha may lack Dubai's obsession with bling, but it is still filled with a glitz that numbs the senses and distorts perceptions of reality. many parts of the city resemble a surreal and incongruent mixture of Hong Kong on the one hand and Tucson, Arizona on the other. It's not surprising that today's Doha is one massive construction site. No sooner are city maps printed than they become obsolete, as new roads and multi-lane highways replace old, snaky streets. Roundabouts, marvels of traffic engineering from a bygone era, a few cars and manageable street flows, are being steadily replaced with four-corner junctions and timed traffic lights. Cranes and other heavy construction equipment are ubiquitous features of the urban landscape. Doha, it seems, is addicted to tearing up its asphalted streets as soon as they're ready for use. Entire neighborhoods made up of older shops and larger single-family homes are razed with unsettling frequency and replaced by tall, glass-covered, gleaming buildings. Remembering directions to points of interest is often an exercise in futility. Taxi passengers frequently find themselves giving direction to their drivers, many of whom are recent arrivees from Bangladesh or Ethiopia. Doha's roads and streets, meanwhile, are seldom without mangled cars strewn on the sides, a product of the world's highest and deadliest traffic accident rates. The municipality's installation of speed cameras all across the city has done little to encourage a culture of driving safely. Unsurprisingly, most Qataris prefer larger, presumably safer cars. The ubiquitous Toyota Land Cruiser, overwhelmingly in white, is the king of Doha roads, the preferred car of Qataris and a significant status symbol. In recent years, more daring colors of black and gray are also seen darting around town. All the while, the city's armies of construction workers, in their tens of thousands, remain as inconspicuous and hidden from public view as possible. The state employs a discourse revolving around the protection of the family to bar bachelors from shopping malls and the souk on so-called family days, and from living in family residential areas. In this sense, bachelor is code word for migrant workers from South Asia, and family designates everyone else, married or not. The biggest interaction between unskilled migrant workers and the rest of the country's residents, save for household maids, are on Doha's congested streets, where, stuck in traffic, tired eyes peer through half-open windows of old American school buses or grungy ones made by Tata, as workers are driven from future high-rises to their distant labor camps. So what I tried to do was to convey a sense of this odd mixture between Hong Kong and Tucson, Arizona. This city that has landmarks named Villaggio and the Pearl that have nothing to do with the culture of the Gulf, but nevertheless are an important part of the country's tradition and its sense of identity, its sense of being. But then I realized that, in fact, Doha, as I mentioned, is a success story. It does have some challenges. It does face some serious fundamental challenges, but nonetheless, it is in many ways a success story. And what are some of the ingredients of that success story? Or what are some of the main factors that have made Doha and Qatar into what it is today? And I discovered that those can be divided very broadly and in summary fashion into four categories. First and foremost, at least compared to the rest of the Middle East and compared to its other neighbors in the Arabian Peninsula, Qatar has a comparative advantage that others don't. In many ways, Qatar has remarkable social cohesion. 10 to 20% of Qataris are said to be Shia, and about 10% of Qataris claim their ancestry to have come from Iran. Nevertheless, the Qatari Shia tend to be remarkably supportive of the ruling family, the Al Thanis. So, unlike Bahrain, for example, where there are fundamental, very major sectarian tensions, in Qatar there's remarkable social cohesion. Also, unlike the United Arab Emirates, which is a confederation, and one of those emirates has a wayward ruler that needs to be bailed out every so often by the ruler of Abu Dhabi, Qatar doesn't have that problem of having a confederation. Qatar also, in addition to its social cohesion, has an extremely small demography. The number of Qataris ranges of Qatari citizens is at most around 200,000. And so it's a very governable, easily manageable country. It also has inordinate resources. It has inordinate wealth. So on the one hand, Qatar has a comparative advantage as compared to all the other regional states. It's got cohesion, it's got a very manageable population and small demography, and it has inordinate resources at its disposal. A second characteristic that sets Qatar apart from the rest of the pack within the Arabian Peninsula and in the larger Middle East is its centralized decision making. In many ways, a way to conceptualize of Qatar, the country, is to think of it as Qatar, a corporation. Qatar Inc. is a very easy way of thinking about it. In many ways, the major decisions in the country are made literally by a handful of people. And there is tremendous centralized decision making. So you can imagine that, for example, the Minister of Energy brings in revenues. The Prime Minister, who also happened to be in charge of Qatar Investment Authority, is the guy who invests the funds that are brought in. Sheikh Mosa, the former emir's wife, is in charge of cultural activities. It's her foundation that has invited universities like Georgetown, Cornell, Texas A&M, Virginia Commonwealth, and Northwestern to come. And she also oversees, along with a couple of her daughters, oversees cultural activities. Then you have the heir apparent, the former heir apparent, who's now for the last couple of months is the apparent. He is the chief deputy in many ways, the emir in waiting. The title of the former heir apparent was deputy emir also. And then you had the emir, who was the CEO, overlooking the whole operation. So in many ways, if you think about it, decision making, from investments to bringing the dollars to cultural activities to overseeing the whole operation, those decisions were made by 5 people. And although the precise number may change by 1 or 2, and some of the personalities might change, the fundamentals of decision making remain concentrated and remain centralized. And that gives the Qatari political system tremendous agility. It gives the Qatari system an ability to capitalize on opportunities that, for example, the Kuwaiti political system doesn't have. Or the Bahraini political system, well, of course the Bahrainis have major problems. Or the Emirati political system doesn't have. So although Kuwait or the UAE might have equal amounts of wealth, or even more wealth, they don't have this centralized and agile decision-making and leadership. But also the other characteristic of the Qatari leadership is that it has an incredibly well-defined vision. There is a vision that characterizes the Qatari leadership's activities and agendas that in many ways is lacking in other parts of the Arabian Peninsula and across the Persian Gulf. It's a vision that initially was motivated by survival strategy. Qatar's hyperactive diplomacy, which I'll mention in a minute, was initially motivated by a survival strategy. When Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani came to power in 1995, there was an almost irrational fear that Qatar would be gobbled up. It would be trampled and overwhelmed by Saudi Arabia or by developments in Iran. And so Qatar engaged in an incredibly hyperactive diplomacy to ensure its survival. And then they realized that it wasn't survival that they needed to worry about, it was getting a place secure on the global map. And then building on that position within the global map to enhance Qatar's larger position within the global community. And so there's a well-defined vision that is being pursued with unmatched passion in Qatar. But also important within the Qatari political calculus is what might be called high modernism. This incredibly active and robust pursuit of modernity, however defined by the government. And the way that the government of Qatar, or the Qatari state, defines modernity is really through construction. And we see the passage that I read from you, whereby actively Doha's geography is being redrawn, and actively Doha's urban landscape is being reconfigured through the building of futuristic cities. Georgetown University, along with other universities, is housed in what's called Education City. There's all sorts of, there's Qatar Science and Technology Park. There is the Pearl Artificial Island. There are all sorts of mechanisms to pursue modernity as defined by the government. And all of this is pursued by construction projects. And the importance of this isn't just in changing Qatar's urban infrastructure, but in tying the state to business actors, in bringing within the orbit of the state and within the employ of the state Qatari business interests and Qatari entrepreneurs. Each of these cities that are being built, Lusail City, for example, being built slightly north of Doha, or within Doha there's Doha Land, not too different from Disneyland, but there's something called Doha Land. And all of these are construction development projects through which the business community is drawn into the orbit of the state, and therefore political stability is ensured and in many ways purchased. Political stability is ensured. So there is remarkable political stability which ties the business community, potential opponents of the state, for example in Kuwait, to the state's vision and its pursuit of development and modernistic projects. Last but by no means least, the fourth element in Qatar's success is its influence and power. One of the things that struck me about Qatar was how a small state, established only in 1970-71, how can a small state become so consequential? How can, there was an event, there was an Arab League meeting in which the Qatari representative in the Arab League, this is before the Arab Spring, the representative from Qatar was very passionately advocating Qatar's speech. And he was very easily dismissed by the representative from Egypt at the time, who said, please sit down, all the people in your country do not add up to the people in one bus stop in Cairo. So how can, and when Mubarak went to the Al Jazeera studios, he turned to his information minister and he said, how can a matchbox like this cause so much trouble across the Arab world? And you, he told his information minister, you employ 20,000 in Cairo broadcasting, and these guys, with their handful of people in Al Jazeera studios, create more problem. So is Qatar, indeed, is Qatari influence for real? And what I discovered is that Qatar, through a number of very carefully calculated foreign policy mechanism, and through its very careful use of its foreign policy toolbox, several tools in its toolbox, has been able to create conditions whereby it can pursue its interests. And what are some of those tools? First and foremost, Qatar pursues a foreign policy that might be best described as hedging. This, of course, comes from gambling. It's a term that comes from gambling, whereby you place one major bet one way. Let's say you bet on the United States to guarantee your security, and you place a number of smaller bets another way. Let's say, for example, you maintain fraternal ties with Hamas, or with Iran, or with other actors that may not necessarily see eye to eye. And what Qatar has been able to do, through its very carefully calculated policy of hedging, is to position itself as an important conduit between various actors that otherwise do not speak to one another. So interestingly, for example, a couple of months ago, Qatar was extremely successful, although aborted in many ways, successful in positioning itself as a conduit between the United States and the Taliban. And that really was an interesting development. Or Qatar has been able to maintain ties, very close fraternal ties with Iran, at the same time as it is anchored in under the American security umbrella and American cultural institutions like universities, and of course American economy and diplomacy, or economic patterns of development and diplomacy. And this is what might be called subtle influence. And what Qatar has been able to do through its subtle power, through its exercise of subtle power, is to create a set of conditions, a set of structures, whereby it can exert its influence in quite subtle ways, through its international investments, through its careful pursuit of hedging as a foreign policy initiative, through its very deliberate, very aggressive branding effort, as Al Jazeera TV station represents. Qatar is extremely active in branding itself, and of course through a very aggressive advertising campaign. If you fly anywhere in the world, you will see advertisements for either the national carrier or for Qatar Foundation, or a whole variety of other Qatari entities and interests that will help together create a set of conditions. And of course, needless to say, Qatar's international investments are extremely important. So let me end, if I may, with a passage from the book's conclusion, which in many ways points to some of the upcoming challenges that Qatar is likely to face. Unfortunately, Sheikh Hamad did not wait for the book to be published before he decided to retire. First he retired, and then the book came out a couple of weeks later. But in many ways, some of these very sources of success, that centralized decision making, I think can also become major challenges for Qatar in the future. So here's how the book concludes. Paradoxically, the biggest challenge facing the Qatari system in the coming years has also been one of its biggest assets in the recent past, namely its personalist nature. The regime's focused decision-making has given it agility and flexibility. Sheikh Hamad, the balancer, has been a great navigator of his region's troubled waters and his own family's fractured past. Up until 2003, incidentally, Qatar had never had a successful, smooth transition of power. Every time there was a transition of power, up until 2003, it had come about as a result of a palace coup. But in 2003, of course, all that changed. Sheikh Tamim, the former heir apparent, has had on-the-job training for a number of years, since 2009, 2010, assuming an increasingly more visible and active profile in the decision-making process and in the country's diplomacy. But whether and how and future generation of Qatari rulers will deal with the same challenges that his father did remains an open question. Let us make no mistake about it. Regardless of its stewards and their visions and capabilities, Qatar's power is underwritten by its wealth. And as long as that wealth continues, so is the likelihood that the sheikhdom will project a much larger image of itself than its size and abilities warrant. The length of the country's current moment in history and how long it can project a form of power that is by all accounts incommensurate with its size, history, infrastructure, and industrial and scientific resources depends directly on how long and in what ways its wealth lasts and can be prolonged. The real challenge is for Qatar to carry on business as usual in the post-oil era. Until then, the country can rest reasonably assured of its place in the limelight of history. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mehran, for a very engaging presentation of your book. I predict that there are going to be many books following your wake now, talking about Qatar. I will now open the floor to your questions. Mehran will field his own questions, but I'll only ask you please to identify yourselves before you ask your question, and keep your questions brief and to the point if you don't mind. So, thank you.
Sure.
Hi, my name is Mehran, I wanted to ask you, you emphasize the remarkable social cohesion and the efforts the regime makes to draw in the business community, for example. I was wondering if you have any thoughts on how the regime deals and how new emir deals with domestic dissent. I'm thinking, for example, of the poet Muhammad Ibn Adi, who was serving a 15-year jail time, and I think that the new emir has chosen to uphold that that sentence. So do you have any thoughts on what's going on there?
Yeah, you mentioned domestic dissent. Qatar is remarkable for its lack of domestic dissent, particularly in comparison to other regional states. Doesn't mean there aren't individuals or chatter, particularly in the social media, and in particular Twitter, against erosion of culture or against some of these developments. But by and large, you don't have dissent in the country. And I'll tell you why there's absence of dissent. First and foremost, the average per capita gross domestic product is around $354,000 a year. And so Qataris tend to be remarkably wealthy and are aware of that wealth, particularly in comparison to Bahrainis or even Emiratis and the Saudis and Kuwaitis. So they know how good they have it economically and financially, and they know that they need the state for their continued accumulation of wealth. So that's one factor. But the other factor is that Qatar has an incredibly well-developed and detailed welfare system. And for Qataris, almost from cradle to grave, every need is addressed and taken care of. To use a political science jargon, Qatar is the perfect rentier state. And in this kind of a state, the kind of issues that become salient and tend to exercise people and tend to excite people aren't necessarily issues of accountability. They're not demands for transparency. What they are demands that revolve around what might be termed cultural politics. For example, why is there pork sold in the country's only liquor store? The question of erosion of culture. As you know, for all intents and purposes, in Qatar, the lingua franca is English. Everybody speaks English. And even Qataris, particularly Qataris who now attend these American branch campuses, oftentimes these Qatari students don't speak Arabic fluently and don't have Arabic writing literacy. And so issues that revolve around cultural politics tend to be those that are important. The erosion of cultural authenticity, the erosion of Gulfi culture or Qatari culture, rather than demands for transparency. And these issues can be relatively easily addressed by the powers that be. You, for example, can ban the sale of alcohol in the Pearl, as the government did summarily. Or you can somehow address, for example, the sale of pork in the country. So, by and large, at least for the time being, given the current political economy of the country, the Qatari population tends to be apolitical for a whole variety of reasons. Doesn't mean there's no individual dissent, and that may exist. Now, is this something that the sentencing of the poet, is it something that Sheikh Tamim personally upheld? As you know, the poet is accused of personally insulting, of a very personal type of insult against the ruling family. And that becomes extremely difficult in the context of that culture, in the context of that kind of political system to pardon. Having said that, let's not forget that Sheikh Tamim has been in office only a matter of months. And so it will take a couple of years at least for him to put his personal stamp on the political system, as it took his father a couple of years to put his stamp on the Qatari political system. So things might still change. I promise to keep my answers shorter. Yes, sir, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Professor. I wanted to go back 1 second to your opening anecdote on Is Qatar real? And I want to ask you, how sustainable, to your opinion, Qatar is, even on a more mediocre level, considering a demography of 200,000 people? How does it transform traditional issues to pragmatism? For example, the women empowerment and issues of expanding Qatar, not geographically, but rather to include more citizens, because for growth you need people. This is my question.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not sure if for growth you necessarily need people. Depends on how you work with your demographic limitations. No doubt the small size of the population poses major challenges. For example, in terms of having a robust diplomatic corps or having a robust national bureaucracy or civil service that can staff your ambitions and can follow through. But at the same time, a limited demography can serve several distinct advantages, or can be used to your advantage. For example, if all of your middle class is imported, then you don't have to deal with an inherently politically troublesome middle classes. If you don't have a domestic and indigenous working class, you don't have to worry about strikes. And if the working class goes on a strike, you deport them. And then there's a ready pool of replacement. So I think it depends on how you can massage and handle these demographic limitations. Some of these states, particularly Qatar, can use it to their tremendous advantage. Not having, in fact, in many ways you can argue that Qatar has pursued an industrial policy that has deliberately hampered the development of an indigenous domestic working class. And at the same time, a domestic and indigenous middle class. Because these guys can be troublesome. They can, we go back to Samuel Huntington's classic King's Dilemma. They can have demands of political participation and political empowerment. Having said that, and I go back to one of the other points you raised, women's empowerment. Qatar has pursued a very deliberate and very active policy of women's empowerment under the patronage of Sheikh Mossa. And so you see a deliberate effort by the state to empower women. Incidentally, and the government doesn't even have to try that hard. Qatari women, particularly younger women, tend to be far more motivated than Qatari men. 75% of Qatar University, the national university, is women. Only 25% of it is men. Of these American branch campuses, for example, at Georgetown, 60% of our student body is female, 40% is male. So in many ways, that's a part of the natural sense of wanting mobility, and of course the government facilitates that. Let's go in the back, Nikhil.
Professor, I was wondering, before 1995, Qatar was in many ways subservient to its larger neighbor, Saudi Arabia. And then under the leadership of Sheikh Hamad, Qatar was able to act much more independently of its larger neighbor, much to its chagrin. Now, in this new era, under the leadership of Sheikh Tamim, while I realize this isn't necessarily accounted for in the book, I'm wondering if you foresee that Sheikh Tamim may, and the new leadership, again without Sheikh Hamad bin Jassim, will be able to act independent of its larger neighbor, and will this perhaps be the end of, as you call it, Qatar's moment in history?
That's an excellent question, and I think it's too early to answer. We have yet to see. But allow me for a minute, if Professor Abi-Mershid would, to very quickly share with you an anecdote. Up until 1995, the former Emir, Sheikh Khalifa, would go to Riyadh every 6 months or so and thank the Saudi king for his magnificent leadership of the Arabian Peninsula, not just Saudi Arabia, of the Arabian Peninsula. And that homage that the Qatari Emir would pay to the Saudi king was extremely personally resented by a younger generation of Qataris. In 1995, that younger generation of Qataris came to power. Those were Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa, the Emir, and the likes of Sheikh Hamad bin Jassim, who later became the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister. And so, from 1995 on, we have a crop of Qatari leaders that in many ways personally resent this secondary position that was ascribed to Qatar in relation to Saudi Arabia. And we see this in terms of their foreign policy pursuits, to deliberately come out of the Saudi shadow. And as you know, up until 2010, 2011, there was tremendous tension between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, largely because Qatar was so determined to come out of the Saudi shadow, and the Saudis resented it and dismissed Qatar as upstarts. And even recently, there was a tweet by Prince Bandar of Saudi Arabia dismissing Qatar as a country of 300 people and a TV station. And of course, the Qatari foreign minister tweeted back saying that we raise our kids to be a lot more polite than others. And so a Twitter war of sorts ensued. Does Sheikh Tamim and the new crop of Qatari leaders have the same visceral resentment of the Saudi behemoth? I don't know. I don't think we know the answer to that. Probably not. And but again, I think we will see the ultimate results of Sheikh Tamim's stamp on Qatari diplomacy in a year or two still. So we don't know yet. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Kamrava, for a fascinating presentation. My name is Gavin Chalio. I'm a second-year master's student here at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. And I was wondering, I've not had the pleasure of visiting Qatar yet. I hope to soon one day. I was wondering if you were to advise another state on political reforms, what kind of advice do you think the Qatari system can give them?
What kind of advice Qatari system would give to another system on political reform?
Or, it seems to be very effective, so I was wondering whether this is something that could be reproduced elsewhere.
I don't think Qatar is in any position to advise on political reform. It's ultimately a non-democratic political system. It happens to be a remarkably stable non-democracy, but it is by no means a reformed, if you mean by reform a democratic political system. It's not a reformed political system. And that actually brings up a more interesting question as this thing keeps fainting on this microphone. That brings up an interesting question, the modus operandi of decision making. Why does Qatar make some of its decisions the way it does? For example, how could a non-democratic political system have the audacity to bring in a number of American universities that teach liberal arts in a non-democratic environment? Or how dare does Qatar support the yearning for freedom in places like Libya and Syria? Thank you, sir. Whereas itself is a non-democratic political system. And so what are some of the calculations that go on in the minds of Qatari leaders that prompt them to make these decisions that really don't seem quite logical or in many ways coherent? And my response to that, or my gut feeling to that, is that they make decisions based on several calculations. First and foremost, is this the right decision? Does it serve our interests? Does it not alienate the United States? Even if they don't agree with it, does it not alienate them? And is it something that brings us kudos in the international community? Does it bring us, does it help our branding efforts? Does it help Qatar Inc. in those terms? Now, conspicuously absent from those calculations are the consequences, particularly unintended consequences. And so I think the assumption is that we've got enough resources to deal with whatever unintended consequences may arise. So in 10 years, when you have a robust alumni of all these Qataris who are graduates of Northwestern University Qatar, and Carnegie Mellon University Qatar, and Georgetown University, all of these, when you have a robust group of alumni, and they start asking questions about transparency and lack of accountability, and when they start politicking, how do you deal with it? I think the assumption is that, well, we've got enough resources to deal with it at that time. Professor Tucker.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I look forward to reading your book.
Thank you.
So, recently one has noticed there seems to be an uptick in the level of public discourse internationally on labor issues in the Gulf in general, but in Qatar in particular, in connection with the World Cup and sort of hyper-building programs related to the Cup.
Right.
So I'm wondering if how this is registering, if it's registering, if there's any visible reaction on the part of this small group of key decision makers to what appears to be shaping up as a more significant public relations problem than they've had in the past in this area.
That's right, and that's another excellent question. First and foremost, I should say that with power comes power curse, because you start attracting the wrong kind of attention. Once you start getting involved in and becoming visible, then things become fair game and you open yourself up to scrutiny, which is exactly what has happened in Qatar. And the Qataris are extremely sensitive to their image. And as I mentioned, branding is one of their main concerns, and how Qatar is perceived. And they've been surprisingly very concerned domestically about this, what is turning out to be an image problem. And so Qatar's Ministry of Labor has had several high-profile meetings and announcements saying they're going to address these, and they're going to look into living conditions of migrant labor. Now, to what extent this is meaningful and to what extent there will be follow-up is, of course, yet to be seen over time. But certainly there is keen awareness that this sort of publicity can really attract the wrong kind of attention and can ruin the Qatar brand. And so there's been remarkable sensitivity over the last couple of weeks to the report by Guardian. There have been front-page news stories about looking at conditions, but at the same time, there's been also an attempt to say, well, what the Guardian newspaper has reported, and these videos are out of context and they're exaggerated. So there's been some of that, but at the same time, there's also been what seems like a genuine attempt to address the problem. Yes, the lady.
Thank you for your very engaging talk. I have a related question, I think. It seems like part of this aspect of Qatar's reputation around the world has to do with this idea or this excuse that something about Qatari culture makes it inevitable or inherent that somehow they would be less democratic. And this seems to kind of fly in the face of this active modernism that they're trying to pursue in other forms, like in terms of agriculture, developing urban space, and developing this technology. So I was wondering how aware these political figures we're talking about are of actively promoting this kind of excuse of being non-democratic for these cultural reasons versus the modernity they're trying to pursue in their urban development.
Well, I'm not sure if they phrase or frame the discussion in the terms that you described, at least not quite in those terms. One thing that Qatar has tried to position itself as is a successful bridge between science and Islamic tradition. And in fact, in 2010, Doha was chosen as the cultural capital of the Arab world, much, I'm sure, to the chagrin of Cairo and Damascus and the other real capitals of Arab culture or historic capitals of Arab culture. But one of the things we've seen is a very deliberate attempt on the part of Qataris to say that modernity and culture, or Arab culture and Arab heritage, are not necessarily antithetical, that they can easily and successfully be synthesized together. And so we see this, for example, in the invitation of these American universities. We see this in Qatar has set aside 2.8% of its national budget to scientific research. That's an amazing amount. In many ways, unparalleled elsewhere, at least in the Middle East that I know of. And so there is a very deliberate effort to foster progress. But at the same time, with an eye, you don't have to abandon, the assumption is, your tradition. You don't have to abandon your culture. And if you look at the national vision of the country, Qatar 2030, the national vision is a document that is supposed to guide the state's attempts and agendas over the next couple of decades. There is very deliberate attention to progress and modernity on the one hand, and preserving culture and tradition on the other. And interestingly, the Qatari state and some of its main leaders oftentimes make a deliberate effort to say, this is what sets Qatar apart from a country like Dubai, or an emirate like Dubai, where Dubai tries to completely ignore tradition and completely abandon what is Gulfi or what is unique to its tradition and heritage. We foster progress and modernity at the same time as we're careful about our tradition. Professor, I look to you to let me know how long to go. So I'm at your disposal, and I'm at the disposal of everybody. I am. It's now about 2-3 a.m. Doha time, so we have all day. We have all day. Professor, my good friend.
Thank you. Lawali Adi, visiting scholar at the CCIS. I am from the University of Lyon, France. So thank you for this presentation of Qatar. I would like to come back to the labor issue. I think it's a very serious problem, at least since the international opinion is sensitive, and many newspapers and many observers are talking about a modern slavery. So in your answer to this issue, you said that the Qatari government is trying to fix the problem. My question is, there is a willingness to fix the image of Qatar abroad, or to fix the problem in itself?
Good question. Well, I think you start out with the assumption that there is a problem. And I wish we had an hour or two to discuss this. The question is, why does labor keep coming? If the problem is so dire, if their situation is dire, if, as we commonly assume, there is a modern form of slavery, why is it that there's an inexhaustible stream of labor coming to Qatar or elsewhere in the region? Is it indeed as dire as we think it is? Or does the average construction worker in Qatar earn 8 times the amount that he would earn had he stayed in Nepal or India, back home? So I think there are major problems. There is abuse, there is horrible conditions, there are, no doubt, there is all sorts of exploitation. There might indeed, in fact, be, in instances, certain types of slavery. But at the same time, I think we need to contextualize and not generalize on the condition of all migrant workers. And so I think one of the things we need to keep in mind is that the situation is extremely complex. There are people who come, make tremendous amounts of money, go back. There are massive amounts of remittances. There is so much remittances going back that recently the government of United Arab Emirates said, we want to tax remittances, because taxing those remittances is a huge revenue streak for the UAE. So now I don't think that's quite workable, and Qataris aren't going to do it, or at least they haven't announced they want to do it. But I think the situation of migrant workers is extremely complex, and I don't think we can say that based on anecdotal evidence that we hear, we can therefore generalize that all workers are in a dire predicament. Now, having said all of this, I realize that I'm explaining or trying to talk about an extremely complex, a very emotionally charged subject in a couple of seconds, and which I can't do justice to. But I think it's important to keep in mind that there are people who make a lot of money, and there are people who are exploited and whose passports are confiscated and are not paid for months and work in horrible conditions and then have to go back to horrible camps. But at the same time, there are those who are much better off working as migrant workers in Qatar than they would be had they stayed. And again, the question of, if it's so bad, why do they keep coming back, I think is an important question to address. Yes, sir.
I was wondering if you could please talk about what is Qatar hoping to achieve by hosting the World Cup in 2024, and to what extent do you think they'll achieve those goals?
Well, it's trying to achieve the same thing as it tried to do back in 1996 when it started Al Jazeera. And the same thing that it tried to do back in 2006 when it hosted the Asian Cups. And what it tried to do back in 2012 when it hosted the Asian football or soccer tournament. It's trying to achieve branding. It's trying to say that it is not just a member, that it is consequential and it is important within the Arabian Peninsula, but that it is important in the Middle East and in fact beyond. And so all of these showcase projects, Al Jazeera, the national airline, these high-rise buildings, these hosting the World Cup, hosting, all of these are showcase projects that are designed to enhance the country's brand and its image. Yes, in the back.
Thank you. Professor Kamrava. My question is, you've talked about Qatar's hedging. Now, do you think Qatar's hedging in Syria, Libya, Egypt have failed, basically? Or, like, in the last 3 months, we've seen how people in Egypt, how Qatar supporting the Muslim Brotherhood, the party they supported failed. In Libya, people are talking about Qatar interfering in their domestic politics. In Syria, Qatar is taking a back step to Saudi Arabia. We've seen that even yesterday in the peace conference that was going on in London. So what do you think? Do you think that Qatar's hedging have failed, or they messed up in their hedging?
That's a very good question. Hedging is a risky, by nature, it's a gamble. And it's an incredibly risky foreign policy. And in addition to things you mentioned, about a month ago, somebody put a sign on the Qatar Airways office at the Tripoli airport saying, we don't want you, go away. And then Qatar Airways jet was not allowed to land in Tripoli, I believe. And so it had to go to Alexandria, Egypt, and land, and then finally made its way to Tripoli. So Qatar, and it has taken a back seat in Syria, certainly in relation to Saudi Arabia. And a couple of weeks ago, the government of Egypt, talk about a slap in the face, returned to Qatar $2 billion that Qatar had given as in the form of long-term loans and grants to the Egyptian government. So the question, as you pose, is whether or not Qatar's hedging strategy has failed. I'm not sure. I think it could very well have failed. It could very well have backfired. I think these are setbacks. My hunch is that in the long term, Qatar has positioned itself. The one thing about subtle power to keep in mind is the creation of conditions. It's the creation of overall conditions that become favorable, and you can cash in those favors. You can call in those favors when you want them. And so you might take a couple of hits in the short term. And these examples that we just mentioned could be a couple of short-term hits that Qatar is suffering. I would be reluctant, for now at least, to say these are part of a long-term series of setbacks that are rolling back Qatar's influence regionally and globally. It just so happens that right as these things are happening, there's a leadership transition in Qatar that has taken place. And the new leader, Sheikh Tamim, has a decidedly different style, and his foreign minister has a very different style than the former foreign minister. And the emir has a very different personality and different style. He doesn't seek the limelight. He's not thirsty or hungry for the global stage in the same way that Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa, the emir, was, or for that matter, Sheikh Hamad bin Jassim, the former prime minister, was. Interestingly, the former prime minister was also the minister of foreign affairs. The current prime minister is also the minister of internal affairs. And so there appears to be, at least in the short term, a more inward focus in line with solidifying the emir's domestic power base. And so in the long term, things might change, but at least for now, the leadership transition and the new style of leaders has had a seeming effect on the foreign policy of the country, or at least in its diplomacy, if not in its foreign policy. Yes, sir. And I'll come.
Wanted to wait for the microphone. Thank you so much for a very, very interesting talk. Given that Qatar owes so much to the presence of immense natural resources, and that those natural resources are so important to the energy industry, is Qatar concerned that over the long term they must seek a diversity in their economy to not become so dependent upon those natural resources, particularly natural gas? And in the short term, given that so much seems to be changing in the international energy industry with unconventional sources of energy becoming more and more visible, is Qatar concerned that its recent success in exploiting those natural resources might become less of an advantage?
Thank you. There's a rhetoric and there's a reality. The rhetoric is that Qatar is trying to foster a knowledge-based economy in the post-oil era. And so the new buzzword, or it's actually not that new, for the last few years, the buzzword has been knowledge-based economy in preparation for the post-oil era. Now, a knowledge-based economy is great. It sounds very exciting. It sounds interesting. In reality, it doesn't. At least in a rentier political system, in a rentier political economy, in a fundamentally oil-based political economy, it's far from reality. The actual reality is that what Qatar is trying to do is to prepare itself for the post-oil era through its international investments. So it uses its sovereign wealth fund to position itself in a way that can bring it revenues when its LNG, liquefied natural gas, dries up. And now, interestingly, one thing that Qatar does is that it has, as you know, it's the world's largest supplier of liquefied natural gas, but it also has long-term contracts with its purchasers. These contracts usually go for 20 years or 30 years, and so Qatar is not as vulnerable to the vagaries of the market as, for example, a purely or largely oil-dependent country like Saudi Arabia might be. Yes, sorry.
Thank you. So what did you mean? There have been so many good questions. I'm relegated now to the celebrity gossip question. And that is what is Sheikh Hamad up to? What is he doing now that he is no longer Emir? And Hamad bin Jassim also. In a country where there are so few decision makers and so many people that drive the agenda, these guys sort of fade into the background. What is their role moving ahead, and what are they doing in the meantime?
That's a very good question, and I don't think anyone is in a position to answer. Certainly I'm not in a position to answer. Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa's official title is the Father Emir. And so he does have an official title as the Father Emir. And he was recently photographed in Paris attending a horse race in Paris. I think this is a genuine retirement. It is not meant for him to be a backseat driver, nor is it meant for the former Prime Minister, Sheikh Hamad bin Jassim, to still be active. I think it is a genuine retirement. I think it is a retirement that was in the making for some time. Of course, it's easy in hindsight to second guess and say, well, I knew this was going to happen. But back in 2010, quite frankly, there were some rumors that because of the Emir's health at the time, he was going to retire and abdicate in favor of his son. But then the Arab Spring hit. And in the heat of the Arab Spring, the assumption is that it wasn't the right time to retire, and so he was eagerly looking forward to retirement for some time for a variety of reasons, some of it having to do with his state of health, and he is retired and he's now enjoying retirement. Remember, both the former Emir and the former Foreign Minister and Prime Minister are incredibly wealthy people, and so they are enjoying retirement in style. So much for gossip. Yes, sir.
You want to take 2 more questions and that's it?
2 more questions. Yes. Yes, sir.
Microphone. Great. Thank you so much, Professor. In your assessment, to what extent is the continued prominence of Qatar dependent on the acquiescence or the support of the international community, and particularly the United States, in it playing this role? I mean, surely the presence of the largest American air base in the Gulf is significant for Qatar's national security, particularly when you have prickly neighbors like Iran and Saudi Arabia, and the hundreds of millions which the Qatar has spent on military equipment from the US and other countries is not really much used without American contractors to maintain it and to train the Qataris, etc. Similarly, if we look at the LNG industry, my impression, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that it's essentially run by Western expat staff, and there isn't really a domestic capacity to maintain that. So in a situation where the US or the West, more widely speaking, is maybe thinking of reducing its military or political footprint in the region, is Qatar's continued prominence sustainable? Thank you.
Excellent question again. A couple of things are important to keep in mind. Qatar's hyperactive diplomacy and its risk-taking would not have been made possible had it not been for its firm positioning under the American security umbrella. So the fact that the United States maintains the largest forward base in Qatar, in the world, in Qatar, has a lot to do with Qatar's ability and Qatar's sense of security to then pursue its hyperactive diplomacy and to engage in many of its ambitious diplomatic, economic, and other activities that it wants to do. So surely, the American security umbrella affords Qatar the opportunity to do many of the things it would otherwise not would have been able to do. One correction, though, to one thing that you mentioned, and thanks to WikiLeaks, we know that compared to all the other Gulf states, Qatar spends remarkably little on its military hardware. And it's, again, part of the genius of its foreign policy. They know the Americans are there, and so why spend millions or billions of dollars in the same way that the Emiratis or the Saudis do on hardware? In fact, in WikiLeaks, there's a very interesting cable in which one of the high-ranking Qatari military commanders complains to the Americans and says, my budget keeps getting cut, and I want more budget, and it's cut by 10%, which is really interesting because the government was secure in in the fact that the United States is there, so why bother spending money on military hardware? Having said that, recently they've placed a couple of major military purchases. Having said all of this, for the last 35 years, all of the states of the Gulf Cooperation Council have capitalized on America's tensions with Iran. They have seen US-Iranian tensions as an opportunity to position themselves as America's allies, as America's reliable allies, with the former ally Iran being a pariah state, with the former ally Iraq being a pariah state and for all intents and purposes dismembered or at least in shambles. All of these states, Kuwait, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates in particular, have capitalized on US-Iranian tensions. The big question, the big variable, the unknown variable is what is going to happen if those tensions between Iran and the United States get reduced. And we see the Saudis, in particular, extremely nervous. You know that Secretary Kerry just met with the Saudis in Paris to allay their fears. The Saudis are nearly as nervous as Prime Minister Netanyahu of a possible US-Iranian, I don't want to even use the term rapprochement, but a reduction of tensions between these two parties. What would they do then when the Iranian boogeyman is no longer there? And I think that's the thing to look at.
My prerogative is to ask the last question and then give you a break because I think we've worked you out tonight.
My pleasure.
But I want to go back to the another dimension of big politics and ask you whether you see, as Doha starts to transform itself into a global city, as Doha is transforming itself into a global city, do you also see its leading elites, this handful of technocrats who are ruling the state and designing its policy, do you see them engaging in some of these global issues like food security, global warming, the spread of epidemics, diseases, these kinds of issues? Or is the habit of hedging as a foreign policy strategy in fact hindering Qatar from developing any kind of consistent approach to these issues, which surely have to impact the future of Qatar in the long term?
Thank you. Excellent last question. Small states in general often specialize in particular issues, and they become what might be called norm entrepreneurs. They specialize in a specific norm, and then they that becomes their area of expertise. Norway, for example, or other small states, they specialize in one particular issue. So Qatar is no exception. At the same time, I've mentioned Qatar's preoccupation with branding. But not only is it interested, and so Qatar has, for example, been very active in dialogue of civilizations, in civilizational dialogue, and Sheikh Hamosa has been one of the main figures involved with some of the other global figures, trying to reverse this clash of civilizations, global clash of civilizations, or to at least remedy it in some ways. And so Doha fancies itself as a hub and a forum for some of these global dialogues. Now, in addition to all these, you mentioned food security. For Qatar, food security is a real, tangible threat and a major concern. It's a real concern. And the Qataris, since particularly the price hikes of 2007-2008, the food price hikes of 2007-2008, have specialized and made a deliberate effort to place themselves as one of the pioneers of addressing food security issues. And so not only to allay their own food security, but to also see what are some of the ways in which global food security issues can be addressed. And so what the Qataris are trying to do, out of necessity as well as in order to enhance their own brand, and also because structurally they're a small state, and small states tend to specialize in some of these niche areas. As a result, Qatar has been extremely active and on the forefront of issues like women's empowerment, food security, science and technology, and now they're building what is a mammoth research hospital in order to address some of the major diseases that are endemic to the region. With tremendous wealth comes also some diseases such as, for example, adult diabetes, childhood obesity, and some of those other things that Qatar is now trying to position itself as a global leader in addressing. I hate to end tonight's discussion with a mention of diseases, but it's been a pleasure and an honor being here. Thank you all, and my thanks again to Osama.
Before you adjourn, if you don't mind, I would like to say that we have Professor Kamrava for 2 more days here. First, he'll be appearing at the Carnegie Endowment tomorrow at 1 p.m. to give a talk. And then back here at the CCAS for a conference on religious and secular trends in the Middle East and North Africa. And he will also be giving a paper on Qatar's involvement with some of the religious developments in the region. So please join us again tomorrow and the day after. But for now, please join us outside for some snacks, and feel free to continue the conversation with Professor Kamrava. Thank you again very much, everyone, for listening.